Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960, infrastructure and investments. And what we're going to do is a topic we've discussed on the show on numerous times before. And an old political colleague of mine, sometimes competitor as well, by the name of Tim Murphy, who is the executive partner at McMillan LLP, a law firm downtown Toronto and across Canada, has written a book on infrastructure. And so I thought we'd check in with him and find out a little bit about what's going on in his career and why he wrote this book and what his message is. Tim Murphy, how are you? Welcome to our show.
Well, it's great to be here and great to see you. And in one way, great to be doing anything, frankly. No, this is a great show. And I think what you're putting on air is fabulous, and I'm just proud to be part of it. So thank you for asking me.
Tim, it's my pleasure. So why'd you write a book on infrastructure? Why would anyone be excited about and interested in infrastructure?
You're not the first person to ask me that question. In part, well, what happened was I was working in Ottawa for Paul Martin when he was finance minister and prime minister, and I was his chief of staff. And when the voters decided I should practice law again, I decided had been a litigator and decided I didn't want to do that anymore. And so I thought actually the notion of pulling together people, of trying to build something, putting together a bit of that public sector experience with some of my construction law experience would be an opportunity to kind of maybe move some things along. And just as I was coming back to the law practice, this new idea of public-private partnerships was taken hold, had started in BC, was coming in Ontario. So it made sense as an area to focus on. And so I've been practicing as a lawyer in that area for the last 15, 16 years. And, as I was going through it, there's a lot of misconceptions and challenges. And I thought it made sense then to kind of capture my experience, putting together a bit of that political background with my experience as a lawyer and understanding, and kind of write what is now and currently the only Canadian text on the subject. Now, it's not going to be on the bestsellers list, that's for sure. It's a pretty thick text, focused a lot on the people who spend their time in this sector, but there are parts of it that speak to the public policy context and the kinds of opportunities, including in Indigenous communities and others, that infrastructure using the knowledge, creativity, ingenuity, and financial backstop of the private sector can bring to the public sector and its objectives of getting, better infrastructure built, better infrastructure maintained, and better services to the taxpayer. So that's what the book tries to focus on and explain for public policy people and others.
Have you got a copy of the book handy?
I do. There you go. Look at that. It even has little tabs in it.
What's it called?
Yeah,
what's the proper name?
So it's actually Public-Private Partnerships in Canada, Law, Value for Money and Policy. And it's a LexisNexis book who were kind enough to publish it. And it's 600 pages of barn-burning text.
and is it primarily therefore on 3P partnerships and why they make sense and how to do them?
Yeah, 100%. That's what it focuses on. So, I go through a bit of the history across Canada of these kind of arrangements. I talk about the arguments for and against them, the building up of those across the last 15 or 20 years. So the kinds of projects, the kinds of sectors, and then deep into how risk is allocated to the private sector, what role finance has in it, and then some particular areas and some places for reform and some places for new opportunities that I think are worth looking at.
So we'll delve into it in greater detail after our break. But bottom line, lots of people have said, Highway 407 ended up being, unbelievably costly, and is therefore proof that the whole 3P model doesn't work. What do you say to that?
Well, it's because it wasn't a P3. I mean, frankly, at the time, the government sold a public asset. That is more akin to privatization, which I don't think, there may be circumstance where that makes sense, but that's not a P3. P3 is actually the public sector retaining, by and large, the long-term control of the asset and the long-term policy framework, and bringing private sector ingenuity to it where it makes sense. In the Highway 407 context, frankly, what happened is the government sold a 99-year lease, effectively the full ownership, for what it thought it could get at the time. It turned out they massively underestimated how successful a highway that was going to be. And looking back on it, unquestionably, the taxpayers think they may not have got a good deal, and I have to agree with them.
We're chatting tonight with Tim Murphy, who has written a book on infrastructure, primarily on 3P partnerships, private-public partnerships. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Tim in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're talking tonight about infrastructure. And Tim, I asked you why you were passionate about infrastructure, and you sort of joked about that. I got to tell you, you may know that I'm chairman of an organization, a civic advocacy organization in Toronto called Transit Alliance, which is all about advocating for transit infrastructure. My kids sometimes ask me, Dad, like, what the heck are you doing this for? Like, why? And I say, I'm passionate about infrastructure. And they go, what? Why would anyone want to be passionate about infrastructure?
Well, I think it's because, when you think about how we move around in our cities, like, and what our children attend, the hospitals we have, the roads we use, the water we take out of our taps, frankly, the sewage that we flush away, our electricity, frankly, almost all the things we take for granted, our infrastructure, our public or quasi-public assets that our governments at all levels, build, operate, maintain for us. And doing that better or worse can improve the quality of life of citizens, make a city better, make a country, a province, a more attractive place to live, raise kids, and work. And so if we get it right, we're a better country. So that's a pretty good thing to be passionate about.
I agree. And I think some people think that we're going to have sort of the mother of all infrastructure budgets in Canada and the United States coming up as a way to stimulate the economy coming out of COVID-19 pandemic. What do you think? Does that make sense to spend money on infrastructure now?
So I think, to be honest with you, I think investing in infrastructure that makes sense, that adds to the economy and adds to the quality of life, have always made sense. I think one of the interesting challenges, frankly, as you look at it, is historically, infrastructure has been a pretty male-dominated sector in terms of the workforce. That's changing over time. And COVID has actually had a disproportionate impact on women. And so one of the things, as you think through investing in infrastructure, you have to think through a way to make sure that it's done in the context of ensuring women can get back to participating in the workforce the way they have been before. But there are, lots of opportunities also to build back better, as we've heard some governments say. There's significant investments in electric vehicles and the infrastructure attached to that, charging stations, et cetera. We've got climate change is a huge problem, and we're going to need to invest in green technologies, green opportunities in infrastructure, but also climate mitigation, flood control. So and then, we're talking on a virtual context right now. What about broadband and the inequality in access to broadband? We need to build infrastructure in that context. And then think too about Indigenous communities who need better access to water, electricity, and all the things we are using today and take for granted. So I think there's huge opportunities that to invest, to build better, that create a better life for all of us. And I think and at the same time, help people get back to work and boost us out of the challenge the pandemic has created. So I think absolutely it makes sense.
Some people, think this Build Back Better term is code for only green infrastructure. And Elizabeth May, former leader of the Green Party, I interviewed, and she actually said exactly that almost all the money spent on infrastructure coming out of this pandemic should be on green infrastructure. Do you think that makes sense?
Well, it depends, I guess, on what you mean. I mean, we've got certainly oil and gas is still a significant, it's like 7% of our economy pre-pandemic was maybe more was based on based on oil and gas. And so, but all that being said, you can continue to invest in transitional efforts around, making that more efficient, making more effective, less climate impact. So investing in ways that improve our climate while still investing in traditional areas can both be done. So it shouldn't be viewed as code for, sorry, you're in the old economy, your job doesn't count, but it should mean, we know you're in the old economy and you need the help and the investments to transition to the new economy to make what you do better for our climate. And I think in that context, investing in a green sense makes absolute sense.
I spoke with Minister Caroline Mulroney, the Minister of Transportation provincially, and she was talking about the need for shovel-ready projects. And, I think back to 2009, when Stephen Harper's government at the time was spending money coming out of the fiscal recession, the fiscal crisis of 2008, 2009, and we had a lot of shovel-ready projects. that ended up being almost questionable. I remember arenas that got renovated and implemented a kiosk up in Bracebridge or something like that.
Yes.
Is that a problem that these projects take so long to do the environmental assessment and the planning and the approvals for them, such that when we've got the need because of coming out of a recession, we don't have shovel-ready projects?
So it is a challenge, and I think the provincial government has been taking some regulatory reform steps, passed a bill, I think, last year to help in the process of speeding up approvals and approval processes around major infrastructure projects that were helpful to the overall economy. But, look, the reality is, shovel ready can mean, I think actually municipalities that have, and municipal projects tend to be the one that can be moved fastest to being shovel ready. And so I think focusing on those makes a lot of sense, but it does going to take time. Like, you don't want to spend, $50 million on building, a community center or a new bridge or this and not get it right. So it takes a little bit of time. So shovel ready, I think in the infrastructure context can sometimes mean within a year from now.
Okay. So not completely. Let's talk a little bit about 3P partnerships. So 3P partnerships are public-private partnerships where government and the private sector get together to do something. And I think, initially there was some criticism that all that was happening was the risk was being transferred from government to the private sector, and the debt was being transferred from the public sector to the private sector. And it almost sounded at times like it was almost off-balance sheet financing.
Yeah.
For the federal or provincial government. How do you respond to people that think it's just sort of a way of getting debt off of government's balance sheets?
Well, the good news is that can't work anymore. So the Public Sector Accounting Board, which kind of in charge of how public sector accounts for its expenditures, basically changed the rules. So you can't use those kind of accounting tricks anymore because as any government has to account for those assets and the expenditures on what's called an accrual basis. So I've got a 30-year asset. I've got to accrue the cost of it over 30 years, no matter when I pay the cash for it, or as long as I retain the ownership. And the good news is the model of P3s we use all continue to have public ownership, public control, and as a result, they're properly accounted for in the books. So that kind of, chicanery is no longer used and cannot be used.
Okay, so then what's the benefit? Think about some of these Metrolinx projects that have been done on Eglinton as an example as P3s. What's the benefit to the province to engage these outside parties that I think on times design, build, maintain, and operate the lines?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the benefit, there was a study in the UK done, which was actually one of the big first innovators in using this methodology. And to be honest with you, there were two big advantages. One, the record of getting these things built on time went up enormously in the P3 model. Why? Well, because you were using private money, lenders mostly, and if they weren't getting, they say, if you tell them you're going to get paid on January 1st, they're going to make sure they get paid on January 1st. And so these projects were on time, whereas the public sector may have been less forceful. And secondly, you were finding savings in this way, which was what was happening is, to the point you also made earlier, is risk is being transferred to the private sector. So the risk that an event will occur, something bad happens, is being taken over by the private sector. And yes, you pay them a bit of premium for that, but that premium is not as much as the cost of when it happens. And so the private sector is now responsible for a bunch of risk that in a traditional model, the public sector, we taxpayers used to pay for. And on the net basis, the cost, the financial value of these things were more efficient for the public sector, and they were getting built on time. And the third bit where they operate over the long term is you ask the private sector, okay, you're going to build something, but then you got to pay to operate it. So guess what? They design it now to understand the efficiencies to manage it and operate it in a way that makes sense as a net cost. No public sector does that. In fact, accounting, as you well know, in the public sector, the capital and operating arms almost never talk. And so you got efficiencies built in that way. And the actual experience across hundreds of these now, almost 300 in the last while, is they almost uniformly is the case.
But if there is risk, the private sector is going to charge the public company, the public entity for that risk. Plus they're going to charge them for a profit. Plus they're going to charge them for, time value of money. And so therefore, doesn't that all just get transferred to the public purse?
Yeah, so that's the question. I mean, to me, it's actually just a math and economics question. I'm not ideological about this. If the math of what you propose is true and it's more efficient for the government just to do it itself, then the government should do it itself. But if it's more efficient to take that box, like let's say this, a risk occurs and it costs $10 million to fix the risk. Turns out you're digging in the ground and something happened. The soil isn't the way you thought it was going to be. And it costs $10 million extra to fix it. And the private sector took that risk. They're not going to charge you $10 million in the bid price for the occurrence of that risk. They're going to charge, we don't think it's going to happen. We can be more. They might charge $1 million, as part of the price. And suddenly, right, you've just saved $9 million in the public purse because that risk is now paid for by the private sector. And so you add up all those little risks against the cost of the finance that you rightly identified and a little bit of premium. And that's math, right? Does the net economic benefit accrue to the taxpayer or not? If the answer is it's better for the taxpayer, then do it. And if it isn't, don't. There's no ideology in this. It's all about value for money, as my book says, to the taxpayer.
But if there is that $10 million risk that the private sector you're saying is going to value at only a $1 million risk, that's only going to happen once. Then they're going to learn their lesson. They're going to lose $9 million or $9 billion or whatever that denominator is. And they're going to be out of business. And, we've seen this with some of the, the Metrolinx bids where trains were more expensive and there were delays and disputes. And then governments ended up having to pay more money. Do we really transfer the risk to the private sector when we enter into these P3s?
So I think we do. There are unquestionably circumstances. And look, there's an active debate and discussion in between the private and public sector about, what risks are efficient to transfer to the private sector versus keep in the public sector. And you know what? Part of it is, I sit there and say, okay, these cars are going to be more expensive. Well, guess what would have happened if the public sector hadn't involved the private sector and been ordering those cars? You don't think they would have been late and more expensive too? And then in that case, there's no equity, there's no private sector interest trying to make it faster, better, cheaper to fix the problem. It's just the public sector there taking all the risk without any levers to pull. And so I think even in the circumstance where the bad occurs, and sometimes the public sector does have to come to the table and help, you still have a private sector there that's incented to help make it faster, to make the problem go away cheaper. And I think that's all to the good of the taxpayer.
So I've had some people, we've had with Transit Alliance a couple of conferences on these topics, mention that one of the big issues with P3s when they were originally done in Infrastructure Ontario was putting out some of these bids is they would carve them up into too many little pieces. And, I had one argument, I don't know if this is true or not, but that, the wires for LRT lines didn't fit with the stations, didn't fit with the tunnels, didn't fit with the something else because each one was parceled off into a different package. And so therefore the solution was to do these very large, comprehensive bids where people owned the whole thing and owned the station, the tunnels, the wires, the everything, which was so large that there were only a few little companies, few big companies, that could end up contemplating being the bidder. What do you think of that?
Well, it is. So you got to get that balance right because, you look at Eglinton Crosstown, right, which is a $5 billion plus one single project across Eglinton to help expand our transit system, a much needed project. Well, at the end, it was so big, you only had two bidders, right, who were a conglomeration of a bunch of individual companies who could afford to take the risk of their bit of the risk. And, you would argue generally that you need three bidders for a more efficient bidding process. So maybe you break that down. Now, in other cases, you might, to your point, you want to make sure you can integrate the elements of the project so that they can work together. And so you want a project big enough so that the sensible elements of it can work together and be planned together from both the construction and operation, but not so big that the market literally can't bid to it because it's too huge. And so you see that balance, as they're building like the Ontario line and aspects of the expansion of our transit system across the GTA. I mean, and you've been in your Transit Alliance, and you've been an important advocate for, that expansion and doing it sensibly. And I think that's been an important voice in the debate.
A lot of people don't realize that, the GO trains are run by somebody else, not by Metrolinx.
Yeah.
Does actually having somebody not only build, but design, build, operate, and maintain, do those types of contracts make sense?
I think they do, and here's why, is because one of the things, you see often is if I sit there and I just put out a construction contract, well, I'm going to try and build it, as cheaply as I can. I'm not going to worry about the cost of maintaining that when I build it. So I'm going to put a price in, and you know what, I may save a little money by using slightly cheaper, floor materials or rails or whatever it is, because I'm not worried about the maintenance cost of that. If I have to replace it every 5 years versus every 10 years, not my problem. I'm not the maintainer. If I put those things together into one contract and say, you, private sector, are responsible for both building it and maintaining it. Now I'm sitting there going, well, geez, maybe I better build it with better quality stuff out of the gate, so some of my maintenance costs are reduced. And I make that efficiency calculation in a way that actually produces better value to the taxpayer. Obviously, it depends on the circumstance, how expensive that is. But I think in concept, it absolutely makes sense.
Is this something that's happening across the world, just in Ontario? What do you think is happening with 3P partnerships?
Yeah, so yes, it's been happening. I mean, just as I indicated earlier, it started in the UK. One of the first jurisdictions to do the new model of it was British Columbia under Gordon Campbell, and then it spread to Ontario. I mean, the irony is, as you may know, Premier Mike Harris did a couple of them. The Liberals back in 2003 under Dalton McGuinty campaigned against them, and then actually undertook the biggest expansion of P3 projects in Ontario political history under the rubric of Infrastructure Ontario. And we're very successful, right? They've got over like 150 projects or more in the marketplace with a phenomenal record of on time, on budget performance. And now we've seen that spread, across the country. We've seen them in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Quebec, and the East. I would say what's starting to happen is, as public sector got used to the private sector playing this role, they've started to kind of play with some of the tools. So you see these integrated project delivery is another model where actually the partnership occurs in the front end. So you instead of picking a bidder against a fixed model that the public sector puts out, you get the public sector and private sector bidder then sit together and they try to map out a plan and they share the risk from the beginning. And you see that experimentation starting to happen too. I think the more models we have to kind of think creatively about getting infrastructure built and operated is better. And so I think that's an interesting new trend to add to the P3s, which have had a successful track record.
We had a speaker at one of our Transit Alliance events speaking about the weaknesses of P3s, and that integrated project delivery was the answer. So maybe after a break, we can delve into that a little bit more. But also, Tim, I'd love it if you'd tell us all a little bit about your political background, because I've always been fascinated by someone that has been as successful and as involved in politics as you. Never wanted to run yourself, and actually, I think you ran for a nomination once, as I remember.
Well,
so we'll take a break and come back after some messages and ask you a little bit about your political history, and then go into integrated project delivery. Okay. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're talking about infrastructure and P3 partnerships tonight with Tim Murphy, who is a lawyer. He is an executive partner with Macmillan, which I guess used to be, was it Macmillan Binch at one point in time?
Yes, that's the one. We just, somehow or other, we lost the bench.
Lost the bench? Tim, let's back up for a second. You've been involved in politics off and on for forever, it seems. What got you started in politics?
Well, I was actually way back was a member of the Ontario Legislature internship program, which was kind of an opportunity for people after they graduated to come and learn something. So I went and worked at Queen's Park for a year in that context. And as I've said, I worked for a New Democrat and a Conservative and ended up a Liberal. And so then after that, I was actually worked for the Peterson government when it first got elected for Sean Conway and then Ian Scott. And then helped out some federal candidates. And then in 1993, I actually ran for nomination and was nominated and elected actually in the riding, Ian Scott's old riding of St. George, St. David, and served there for 2.5 years. And then Mike Harris, when he won the majority, he unfortunately, Al Leach beat me. And then in 2001, I went up to Ottawa and worked for Paul Martin as chief of staff in finance. And then when he was prime minister for his whole term. And so in a world where I couldn't hold that job either, I had to come back, and I've now been at Macmillan since 2006.
What was it like being a MPP versus being, chief of staff to a minister of finance?
So I loved being an MPP. Maybe I loved it more than the voters loved me, but that's okay. I think it's a fabulous, opportunity to serve, right? I mean, St. George, St. David was like, so it was, you had parts of Rosedale, St. Jamestown, Cabbagetown, Regent Park, like incredible diversity in terms of economic, social fortunes, and the opportunity to speak for that community in the legislature to try and advance the causes that it needed addressed was a phenomenal responsibility and honor. And I think, I always applaud anybody from any party who wants to try their hand at it. I think it's extremely worthwhile. Now, obviously being chief of staff to prime minister, I used to joke I had the best job in Ottawa because I didn't have to go out and face the cameras and the opposition, and still got to be part of the decision making. And, I think we did some great things when, we passed the same-sex marriage law. We did the 10-year health accord. We did a significant effort around daycare. Unfortunately, was defeated when the NDP took us down. But you get the opportunity to make changes, as you know, in people's lives. And there's not many things that give that reward. And I think that's it's a great thing to have done.
So if you want to have impact, do you have more impact as a MPP or as a chief of staff to a minister of finance or to a prime minister?
So it depends, right? I think both of them can have impact and can have significant impact. It depends on your ability to move an issue, generate an issue, and generate change. I always brought to the job of being a backroom person, a chief of staff, the notion that I was an advisor, not the boss. The boss are the people who are elected. They are the people who are, the voters give the responsibility. At the end of the day, it's their decision, not the staff person's. And so, in that context, whatever authority and responsibility I had was derivative of the person I was working for. When you're an MPP, it's your responsibility, and that has a power and authority that I think it's tough to compare to being a chief of staff.
It's interesting. I'm a political junkie both in Canada and the United States, and the chief of staff to the president is on the Sunday morning talk shows almost every week. But as chief of staff in Canada, you're not, right? You're very much in the back.
Absolutely, and it's and part of it actually, the chief of staff to the president of the U.S. also gets his own or her own plane, which is. You're lucky if you get a car in Ottawa, but it's a bit of a difference in the culture, in part because there is the degree to which the president is an independent political operator, and so he or she sends out people to speak on his or her behalf. Whereas in Canada, you have a prime minister, but part of a party, so you've got cabinet ministers and caucus who can go out and speak on his or her behalf, and I think that's the proper role. They were elected. The backroomers aren't. And I think that difference in culture is good for us. And I think the power of the backroom is a bit of a disabling problem in the US. And we've seen some of that challenge over the last 4 or 5 years.
No question. So Paul Martin, former Prime Minister Paul Martin, sometimes is thought of as an almost better Minister of Finance than a Prime Minister, and is credited with slaying the deficit and the debt at one point in time, and I think it was called the peso crisis at one point in time. When was it? The early 1990s. That really he brought the government finances back in shape. Do you think we need something like that again in Canada today?
Well, I think. Well, not yet, because I think the one thing that, Paul was always of the view that what you needed to do was to have a government that was capable of providing the supports the economy and the people needed when they needed it. And so his view was bringing the government's, deficit and debt back under control was the right thing to do in a context where the economy was starting to pick up, jobs were coming, people were feeling better, but you needed some, hard decisions to be made to make sure that you weren't fundamentally in a higher interest rate environment, basically crowding out your ability to do that by the cost of your debt. We're in a much lower interest rate environment, which is helpful. And frankly, we've got an economy and people that are in desperate need, and investing in them right now is not only the right thing to do, but frankly, we are not the exception, right? Every government is investing significantly in their people as they try and cope with the pandemic. But I think Paul would be very focused on supporting the economy now versus long-term investments. And one of them should be able to be turned off when the economy, the pandemic's over and the economy starts kicking up. And the other is an investment. And keeping track of which is important so that you don't make permanent that which you only need temporarily.
So some people are worried that the level of deficit and debt that we've created because of our, response to the pandemic has excessive, and that we are risking our long-term sustainable economic health. You obviously don't believe that.
I don't yet. I think when you look our overall, debt to GDP ratio, we're still pretty good, and we're way under where we were when, it's still kind of nowhere near where Paul was facing in 1995 when, it was starting to run towards numbers that were unsustainable. I mean, obviously some provincial governments have debts that are significant as a percentage of their GDP, but to be honest with you, when you look at what happened, the federal government used the power of its purse and the good ratios it had to transfer a lot of money to provinces to help them cope with the pandemic so they didn't have to spend much. And then you look at us comparatively, our debt to GDP ratio still tends to be one of the best in the G7 overall. And so I think we're okay. We definitely, have to keep an eye on it, but I think comparatively we're in pretty good shape.
One of the things that the Trudeau government did the last couple of years was establish this federal infrastructure bank. Doesn't seem to have done that much. What do you think of that?
So I unquestionably was slow out of the gate, but what you've seen is a couple of things. You had Michael Sabia come in there as a new chair, and now he's the deputy minister of finance. And so the great news is he was definitely reorienting that organization, giving it some oomph, some focus. And then also now in finance, he can carry that sort of ability to look at projects that it advances and say yes to them. And they've got a new CEO of the organization, who was the former CEO of Infrastructure Ontario, who knows how to get the projects over the line. And they've started to announce things and do things. So I think it was unquestionably too long before they started doing things, but I think they've recognized that, and you're starting to see them launch some projects, get some money spent, get private sector investment into public services and goods. But to be honest with you, right, they're all focused on what are called revenue risk projects, where taxpayers aren't paying for 100% of what's being provided. It's ratepayers, it's the users of the asset that are paying for it. And those always are going to take longer to get from idea to concrete reality. And so the anticipation that they would do anything within a year or two, frankly, in my view, was always unrealistic. We are starting to see it. Like, they made a major investment in that, in the big new rail line in Montreal, right? And they were part of the funding solution to make that happen. And the CDPQ infra is part of that, and that's starting to get built. And so successes are coming. It's taken too long, but I have hope now that they're headed on the right path.
Talk to me a little bit about that big LRT project in Montreal, because it seems like it's exactly the kind of expansive transit network that we need here in the GTA. And it seems like private sector took a far larger role in designing it, planning it, thinking about where it was going to go, getting the political capital to support it, et cetera. And I wonder, why isn't that happening in the GTA?
So I think it takes, I think there's a couple of unique things in Quebec that made it possible that's more challenging here. One of which is that, the Caisse de dépôt, which is sort of the big public pension asset manager in Quebec, entered into a deal with the Quebec government where it basically got a first shot at figuring what to do with infrastructure. And so you had this kind of almost quasi-public-private institution that could take over big projects, big opportunities, and plan it with a public and private sector perspective in mind. And so you don't have that kind of overarching organization with that power and ability here in Ontario. And then you had kind of an opportunity, I think, a little bit, in terms of, you look at kind of density regionality here in Ontario is more complicating. And so I think there's a bunch of factors that have made it more challenging to build in that way, that made it possible in Montreal. Plus, you had a provincial government that was prepared to kind of, break a few eggs to make its omelet.
So at a 3P partnership conference a couple of years ago, a guy from Teachers, senior executive from Teachers, which maybe would be the equivalent in Ontario of your Caisse de dépôt, made the point that they're investing in airports in Brazil because they've got an opportunity to make money there. And the infrastructure in Ontario does such a good job in their bidding process that they squeeze all of the profits out. And in addition, what they said is that unsolicited bid proposals aren't welcome in Ontario, and unsolicited bids, which is the private sector coming up with ideas comparable to what you just described in Montreal, aren't welcomed here by Infrastructure Ontario and the provincial government because everyone's worried about an inside deal and not putting it out to bid. And they said, we're missing out on the expertise. And they went further and said, it's interesting because here we're trying to figure out solutions, and we're asking a civil servant that's never left Toronto to try to figure out the solutions when we've got global companies that are doing, infrastructure projects around the world that could come up with the potential solutions to these problems if only we involved them. Do we have a problem there?
Well, first, for me, it's interesting that he said Infrastructure Ontario did such a good job because he was scraping out the transferring too much risk to the private sector. That sounds like a public agency doing a good job to me, not a bad job. But I think it runs into this problem when you say, because the private sector is going to come and say, hey, let us take over something. And they're going to want a profit out of it, which is not a bad word in my view. But then the question is, the biggest problem in politics is taking something that is a free good and turning into a good that people have to pay for. That is a political nightmare. And so often you look at kind of the services we have, there's a lot of services, like transit, like those things, which, we're not quite prepared to have the kinds of fees, or roads and tolling is another example. We're not, as taxpayers, we're not quite prepared to have, the cost of that paid. And we saw that with the notion of potentially tolling the Gardiner, right? Which was going to, which is in theory, Toronto was all for, but all those surrounding municipalities go, wait a second, all our people who drive downtown would suddenly have to pay for something that is free. Why should we do that? And the politics of that is very challenging. And then the last thing is you get these big pension funds. Frankly, if it's, if the project is under a couple of $1 billion, it's too small for them. And so we just don't have that many projects of that big a size for them to come and help us with. So I think that's a challenge there too.
We're chatting tonight with Tim Murphy, who has written a book on infrastructure and 3P partnerships, public-private partnerships, how to finance them, how to structure them, what they're good for, what they're not good for. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Tim Murphy, who works with McMillan, a big downtown law firm. He's a partner there. What do you call yourself, a national partner?
We're executive partner. I'm on the executive committee of our law firm. We're 275 lawyers across the country, Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, and a Hong Kong outpost as well.
Awesome. Executive partner, I apologize. Long history in politics. He was an MPP. He was chief of staff to Minister of Finance, Paul Martin, and chief of staff to Prime Minister, Paul Martin. And he's been a backroom guy for a long time, a great advisor to a lot of different people. And I think he's on Power and Politics later on today, so he couldn't give me the better time to interview with us. But a real privilege, Tim, to chat with you, and congratulations on your book. Where can people get it if they want to get their textbook on private-public partnerships?
Yeah, well, hopefully we won't crash the website. It's LexisNexis is the publisher, so if you just go to the LexisNexis website, it's available there. Just look under my name and type in public-private partnership and get your copies fast and early.
Tim, are there areas where 3Ps don't make sense?
So I think there are two, one of which we talked about already, which is the notion of, look, you do the math, you do the economic analysis, and it's not value for taxpayer, you don't do it there. But I think one where there's a challenge is where the standards of the service change quickly. So one of the big ones is technology, right? You think about, often, you're going to have, stuff that the user wants to understand, and the tech, we all buy phones, we all buy technology, and 2 years later, the technology had changed. And these traditional 3P models tend to have worked on the basis that you're imposing guidelines on the private sector for the building and use of an asset that's over a longer term. And then it's tough to kind of get a fixed price model to give the public sector certainty when, when the technology changes on a regular basis, when what it can do changes on a regular basis. And so government, Ontario government's tried it a couple of times and ended up not proceeding with the procurement. And so, the point of that story is to say, though, that P3s, all they are is a tool in the toolbox of a government to make sure value is provided to the taxpayer. You don't use it for everything. You just use it for the right thing.
You had mentioned just before the break that there was a proposal at one point in time to toll the Don Valley Parkway and the Gardiner Expressway. Yeah. I've heard also that there's been some proposals to build tunnels to replace the Gardiner Expressway, yeah, and do it by way of a P3 and toll it. Do you think that makes any sense?
Well, I think it's, so I come back to, there's two answers to that. One of which is I think the politics of doing that are going to be impossible. Not impossible, extremely difficult. It's going to take somebody courageous in politics to do that because, as I've said, you're taking what is an asset that people use without paying. I can just drive onto the Gardiner, drive onto the DVP. I don't pay anything extra. And you're saying suddenly to people, you have to pay for it. And that can be a challenge. Now, that all being said, I think there's opportunities when we build new things to add services or add assets to the range of things that the public needs, that you can then, you can charge at that point, and you can actually make a political argument to people. Look, why should taxpayers that aren't getting this service pay for this service? And so you say, like, what if you built like a truck only lane across the north of Toronto, so you get the trucks off the 401 and you charge a toll to them? So that's a little bit of extra cost in the economy, but you make that 401 safer, you make it less congested. So there are ideas out there about adding services where you can charge. I think it's tough to create a free asset and make people pay for it.
So the Ford government's talking about a potential another bypass around Toronto called Highway 413. Do you think that should be tolled? Do you think that should be done by way of a P3?
I think P3 should definitely be considered. And when you actually look at like the 401 East extension, they were P3s. You looked at, 427, that was a P3. You've seen 400 work that's been a P3. Frankly, even all those roadside en routes that sell food and gas, they're all P3s. So there's lots, and I bet you the public doesn't really know that because they used to be owned by the oil companies, and then the government fix that and have a good deal with the existing provider. Now, so whether it should be built, I think I'll leave to the government and the municipalities, but P3s is absolutely an appropriate option. Frankly, building roadways is something, the private sector knows how to do well, and forcing them to be as efficient and cost effective as possible is what every smart government should do.
Tim, is there a infrastructure investment that you would love to see happen, like a Hyperloop between Toronto and Montreal, or what is it that you dream of someone coming in and saying, I want to hire you to be my lawyer to help me get a P3 for this visionary something or other? What would that be?
Well, I think whether we have the economic ability to make this happen, but some kind of system that I'd start with being as fast a possible train connection between Kitchener, Waterloo, and Toronto as we can make happen. Because I think you've got that incredible technology opportunity in Kitchener, Waterloo. You've got the airport when we return to flying, and you've got the downtown. That is a huge opportunity. And then start building that out to make that higher speed rail opportunity to go as far as Montreal. We may not have the density for it in the short term, but to get us off of, to get us out of the air and out of cars and into more efficient, high-speed vehicles built on electricity is good for the environment. And actually should be good for us too. So something like that would be awesome. And from a legal perspective, I know it would take a long time to generate a lot of legal fees.
Tim Murphy, thank you so much for joining us tonight and educating us about infrastructure, about P3s, and about your book that you can get at LexisNexis. Tim Murphy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's our show for tonight. I'm on every Monday through Friday at 7 o'clock on 960 on your AM dial, or you can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca, or you can get all my podcasts and video casts after the fact on briancrombie.com, on Apple Podcasts, and even on Spotify and YouTube. Thanks for joining us. Good night. Thanks, Tim.